Hi, John Garrett, hypertransitory.com, and finally, I want to wrap up this Illustrator logo series um, with a few things about formats and vector versus raster. And I've said before, you want to use Illustrator because it is a vector-based application, and you can really resize and rescale these things without losing quality. But what if you really do need to use rasters, and you need something you can only do in Photoshop, and you need to make a billboard out of it, or you need to make it something that's going to be inside of a truck? Well, what you have to do in that case, I mean, you've got your vector based. So if someone came to me and said, John, I need you to make my logo, you did my vector logo, I need you to make it now so it has all these pictures in it or whatever, filters, and it needs to be this big. Well, I would go to the printer, whoever's going to print those graphics, and do the billboard or put the truck graphics on. I'd say, what size do you need? Well, then once they let me know that, I can then take my vector and I can then export that at the correct size. So let's say that I want to take this and I want to take it and I want to export it, like at 2400 DPI to Photoshop. I'll go to my export, and up here it's defaulting to PNG. But let's say I want to do a PSD on that, and I'm going to show you something that you might run into. Let's say I'm going to export this at 2400, and I want to keep my layers, and I want to make it as editable as possible. But here's something you're going to run into. It's not going to be able to do that. And unfortunately, again, as I mentioned at the very beginning, Illustrator, it doesn't have a lot of the little niceties of Photoshop, and they don't have the budget, the Illustrator team, they don't have the budget and resources, I guess, to do these things. But Illustrator, as far as I know, this version only uses 2 gigabytes of RAM. So that's not enough to do that, make that at 2400 DPI, and I think CS5 uses 4, but even that really is fairly small. A lot of workstations these days, I mean, you might have 16 gigabytes of RAM, and Illustrator doesn't use all of that, but Photoshop does. So again, I don't have the ability to export that from here, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to Photoshop here, and I'm then going to open that logo, and the AI file. It's not an EPS, this is just a plain AI. I'm going to open that, and I'm going to get this. It's going to say, what resolution, what size do you want to open this at? And this is the good thing about vectors. You can rasterize this to any size you want. So I'm going to put in 2400. And if that's what the printer calls for, I could change the size here too, but I'm just going to go ahead and do this. And Photoshop, has access to all the RAM, so it's going to be able to do that for me. And then once I get it in here, I can do whatever I want. I got the correct size. So this is going to be my truck graphic, and I can just save this one as my truck graphic and use whatever filters I want and blah, blah, blah. Of course, I did it in RGB, which you wouldn't do. You'd probably do it in CMYK. But so that's just one kind of workaround for that. If it doesn't export out of Illustrator, you can probably open it in Photoshop, and it'll probably work. But back to Illustrator here. Another thing, if you're going to be exporting these or saving the files, a lot of times you don't want to save it as AI, because you never know. They might have CorelDRAW. They might have, again, I mentioned Inkscape. They might have something else, more likely CorelDRAW than Inkscape. But you're probably better off, if you do a save as, you can probably get away with sending them an EPS. That's going to send them a totally flat file, though, where they're not going to they won't have too much editability left. I mean, it should work fine depending on what options you save. So here I can even, I can choose to save all the way down Illustrator 3 if I want. I'm not too sure how Corel opens these EPSs, but it should be able to open them. Illustrator will have pretty much zero problem with these. If you go down here, your text is going to get broken up, and any text you have is probably broken up because they use a different engine for that. Especially if you go down here, there's no transparency, so everything's going to be flattened into rasters. If there's any drop shadows or anything, you're going to end up dealing with that. I mean, you can choose here to embed the fonts if you want. I'm going to throw a drop shadow on this just so we can see the other option. Let me just throw that on there so we can see when I go to do a save as on this, and I save as EPS. So now this is active, this transparency. And normally when I am exporting something with transparency, I always set it to high, and I'll make sure this is on 100% vectors, because I want everything that's possible to remain as a vector. I want it to remain a vector until the very minute that the RIP rasterizes it. And I'll even check these. I'll change the strokes to outlines and the text to outlines. A lot of times RIPs, a lot of programs actually have trouble with strokes. And you'll see that sometimes when you make a PDF, the strokes don't look right. A lot of times I'll change those to outlines so whatever program I'm going to be using doesn't choke on those or screw them up somehow. Sometimes there's, something goes wrong and it's a stroke. But you can remember that for later. I usually don't mess around down here. If it's a linked file, I mean, again, I mentioned before, I don't tend to use those if possible. I'll embed a image if possible, but I think I've got linked files on hidden layers here, so that's why it's asking me that. And normally I leave the PostScript at level 2. I mean, level 3 should be fairly standard by now, but just in case you're working with someone who has an older RIP, you don't want them to choke on it and be calling you looking for another file. So that's that. You may end up saving a version of this, and then saving another version that does not have a drop shadow, which I can delete from my appearance panel. You might have a one color version, and you might have many versions, and plus the raster version that you exported to Photoshop. You might just have to keep a bunch of versions. As you can see here, as I mentioned before, my effect that looks really ratty because it's showing at the screen resolution there. But then once I put it to 300, then I got a decent looking shadow. But yeah, those are kind of things you're going to need to keep track of. I mean, you could have any number of permutations of the logo, but as long as you can go back to your original vector, you shouldn't be caught flat-footed. You should be able to provide the client pretty much with whatever they need. I mean, normally when I see logos that the only logo that exists is a small, like 500 pixel GIF file, there's not much you can do except recreate it at that point, and hopefully the client is willing to pay for that to be recreated, or otherwise they may be stuck with that. But hopefully you won't get stuck if you keep track of some of these things, and you kind of take care at the outset of the project to start with a basic vector and kind of add on from there, so your client and you don't get caught and end up having to redo something that really was not necessary. So anyway, that should be it for this series, this tutorial. So thanks a lot for watching, and stay tuned for next time.